So, welcome everyone. This is just an opportunity to launch the revised transport planning professional units. And I'm sure many of you will be aware a 10-year review was undertaken by Professor Glenn Lyons, and following that, the Professional Standards Committee used the outcomes from that review to revise the units for today's transport planner. So what I'll do now, just to sort of give you a rough agenda for what we're looking to do today, I will pass over to Martin Tugwell, the current president for CIHT, and Mark Frost, the current TPS chair, who'll both say a few words, and then Glenn will take us through the 10-year review, and then I'll provide a summary of the outcome of the review and a timeline for the full launch of the new units. So I think, Martin, if I could hand over to you.
Thanks, Linda, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be able to join you on this. I was kind of reflecting how 10 years, there's actually a lot's changed in 10 years. But one thing that hasn't changed for me is the importance of transportation planning to the profession and indeed to our communities and our society more widely. And as somebody who's probably spent the vast majority of his professional life as a transport planner, I the importance of the TPP qualification is really close to my own heart. Indeed, my presidential theme, which was about shaping tomorrow today, reflected both my personal and my professional philosophy about how important what we do as transport planners is to the rest of our community, our businesses, and our friends and family. What we do, what we advise, how we guide decision makers, all of that's really important and makes a difference in the world around us. And there's somebody who is not only just the president of CIHT, but also a past chair of the Transport Planning Society. I've been a champion of the TPP qualification from its inauguration. And indeed, it was particularly delighted to see the qualification become a chartered qualification just a few years ago. Now, the importance of transport planning is very much reflected in the work of CIHT. We've worked collaboratively with TPS and indeed other institutions to do pieces of work such as better planning, better transport, better places, or the more recent piece of work entitled Net Zero Transport, working with the RTPI. All of this reflects, again, as I say, the importance of transport planning. I'm no doubt that Glenn will touch on later about some of the work that we did at CIHT under the banner of Futures, not just setting out the need for change, but more importantly, how we might achieve that change in the way we approach planning, delivery of infrastructure. The need for change is irrefutable. We have to decarbonize our transport system. That's not an option. It's not a target. It's a legal requirement. And we need to do things differently. But therein lies actually part of the biggest challenge, because doing things differently and turning the tanker around is not going to be easy, not when we're having to deal with the realities of the real world. But we have seen in recent months that change is possible. And indeed, I'd argue that sometimes some of the changes that we thought were not possible have actually been seen to be possible. And that really reinforces, for me, the importance of, as professionals, always being prepared to challenge received wisdom, to think about what are the outcomes that we're looking for, rather than necessarily just thinking in terms of outputs. And the other thing that strikes me, these challenges are not just distinct to the United Kingdom. They are challenges universal across the rest of the world. And indeed, it's something that's been very much a theme when I've been meeting and talking with our ever-growing international community of members of CIHT, which actually have then highlighted the importance and the esteem with which the qualifications organised and managed by the UK are so important and recognised internationally. So as I said, 10 years, a lot has changed. One thing that hasn't changed is the importance of transportation planning. What I would say is that our work as transport planners have actually been quite instrumental in some of those changes that have happened over the last 10 years. And certainly I look forward to the continued success of the TPP qualification. And I think this review and update of the competencies is a very timely and very appropriate opportunity to celebrate what we've got, and more importantly, how we will continue to shape tomorrow today. Thanks very much, Linda.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. Mark, can I invite you to say a few words?
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so thanks for giving the opportunity for TPS to say a few words at this important moment in the ongoing journey that is the Transport Planning Professional Qualification. I mean, looking back more than 10 years now, it was launched in 2008, and remembering that year, in particular with some vivid clarity, the moments when austerity really started to bite for the industry. I guess it wasn't really such a great time to launch a new professional qualification. It was a very difficult environment in which to set this new baby loose in. However, nevertheless, both TPP and also the TPS professional development scheme that helped support it survived that difficult birth, and I think by any measure it's gone on to thrive, and for many in the industry now has become to the go-to CPT framework, which I think is a testament to a huge amount of very hard work by TPS and CIHT staff over the years. And of course, further crowned, as Martin said, about the achievement of the chartership qualification status from the Privy Council back in 2019, which really helped, I think, cement the fact that we now are an industry that is recognised in our own right, even though we do draw on huge numbers of other industries in completing our work. So, yeah, building on these strong foundations, I think it's fair to say that the profession has grown in authority and reach, and these new revisions, steered by Professor Glenn Lyons, will help us take us into the next decade. And coming to this maybe slightly new, and I only became chair of the Transport Planning Society a couple of weeks ago, two stood out for me. I mean, one was the need to maintain our multidisciplinary nature, and I think this is a real strength of our industry. We welcome colleagues from engineering, planning, modelling, but also community engagement, marketing, psychology, and countless more. And I think that is a real strength, and it really does allow us to bring a different perspective on some of these issues, and maybe a different way of thinking about outcomes rather than outputs, as Martin said. And the real focus there is to be able to combine all of those inputs with an open-minded approach to whatever problem it is that we're trying to solve, and ally that with the strongest ever possible evidence base. And I think there's increasing onus on us as recognised professionals in our own rights to put forward an independent and rigorous view on the projects and proposals that we're asked to progress, and not simply to, as Glenn will say, just repeat the received dogma of the day. And this idea of constructive challenge, I think, is absolutely crucial. And I think without it, there's no chance that we can turn the tanker around. There's a really great line actually in the review which says that it's quicker for us to change our behaviour than for all the frameworks and regulations that we work within to change. And I think we need to remember that. The second theme, of course, is this key issue of uncertainty, and we must be at peak uncertainty. Surely, maybe Glenn can confirm or deny that. And we need to be able to find better ways of explaining that uncertainty and the implications of that uncertainty to a wider public. And I think it's really great that these elements are now going to be made explicit in the TPP. And importantly, as TPS, we've revised our code of conduct to also reflect more clearly these important principles and how important they are for transport planners. So, I mean, finally, I also want to say that we've also been revising the TPS professional development scheme, which said it builds an important building block of TPP in the light of this review, and those will also come online as of next month. And I'm also really pleased that the PDS is continuing to grow in popularity, and including insightfully with overseas applicants, showing that British expertise in this field is being recognised around the world. And obviously, Martin also alluded to that in his point from the CIHT perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, to finish, I would say TPS has got the strongest possible commitment to its skills work. And in Keith Buchan, who's here joining us today on the call as our Director of Skills, I think one of the hardest working and foremost thinkers on this subject. Throughout my chairship, I look forward to working closely with all of our partners and colleagues across the wider industry to progress our shared vision for developing transport planners that are capable of dealing whatever the future may throw at them. And I think the last 12 months have shown that predicting that future is very, very difficult. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Glenn Lyons, who will take us through some background on the 10-year review. Glenn, I believe, are you looking to share your screen?
I will, yes. I'm hoping that you can see that screen. Can you just confirm,
That came
Linda?
through. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much indeed for having the privilege of being part of this launch event. I've really been looking forward to it, and it, as the other speakers have said, it's a momentous point, I think, in the evolution of our profession as transport planners. I'm going to pick up on Mark's point. You tried to draw me there, Mark, but of course I'm not going to say whether we have reached peak uncertainty, because that would amount to a prediction, and as you know, that's the territory I don't want to venture into anymore. I'm also going to say this purely because I'm excited that at what's happened today, and I may never get the chance to say it again. So I was interviewed earlier today by CNN to talk about the future of transport. And at the end of the interview, the anchor woman I was talking to said, "My goodness, you know, I really don't envy you as transport planners. I just realised now what an awful weight you've got on your shoulders." And I think that's true, and we probably all recognise it, even though it's what gets us out of bed in the morning and puts the fire in our belly, as it were. Anyway, to today's presentation, it's not my job certainly to reveal to you the work of the Professional Standards Committee in terms of the new competencies and knowledge requirements, but really to take you on the journey that brings us up to that point. So if I can make a start, some history. And we've had points in this timeline alluded to already, but I think it is worth reminding ourselves, at least in my view, that over the last 20, perhaps 30 years, we have perhaps been in the midst of a regime transition, a fundamental structural change to society and transport. And I've tended to characterize this as the digital age colliding and merging with the motor age. I've put on at the left-hand side of that timeline just a reminder that Tim Berners-Lee only invented the World Wide Web in 1989. And you can see the whole array of different things that have unfolded, particularly related to how the digital age has affected both society and transport itself, of course. And nestled in the middle of all of that was the launch of the TPP. So it already arrived at what you could say quite a turbulent time in our history. But of course, if one fast forwards to present day, you can see that we're launching this in the midst still of the pandemic with very much a sense of deep uncertainty about the future. But what characterizes today is that we're all here speaking to one another through digital connectivity rather than having all arrived on trains into London. So a challenge for us. We're in a period of regime transition. And I feel that's going to be continuing for some years to come. My money's certainly not on anything that resembles a new normal suddenly appearing in the next few months. Martin referred to a key piece of work, which was certainly a great privilege for me to be heavily involved in, which we called CIHT Futures. Some of you on the call may even have been in the workshops that took place for that. And the premise for the exercise, which went around all of the CIHT regions, was really to get a sense of what professionals were feeling about this notion of uncertainty about the future, but also what they were feeling about the way in which we do transport planning or the policy making process, if you like, and perhaps whether there's an alternative, better, more suited way of doing that for the times that we're living through. And in very simple terms, I'm not going to go into great detail now, but on the one hand, if you like, in the left-hand corner, we had predict and provide, our well-known paradigm, which, albeit in very simple terms, is about forecasting a most likely mobility future. We do a little bit of sensitivity testing around that to demonstrate there are bands of uncertainty, and then we set about providing a means to accommodate projected demand. We called that regime compliant. And if you think about it, it's really demand-led supply, and it feels like a rather reactive approach to stewardship over the future. What we set out as an alternative was what we have called decide and provide, as opposed to predict and provide. You're deciding on a preferred rather than a forecast or predicted future, and it's one that's focused on access rather than only mobility. And then the task is to set about providing a means to move towards that future in a way that accommodates the deep uncertainty. So it's regime testing, we called it. It's flipping it around to become supply-led demand, and it feels more proactive, which frankly reflects what I feel is a stronger planning approach. So what did we learn from that institutional initiative? Well, some quick fire insights here. First of all, perhaps not surprising now, but it might have been a little more surprising in 2016, those sleepy days pre-pandemic. There was broad consensus that the future is deeply uncertain. We shared some different scenarios from New Zealand with participants, and what that revealed was that a 50% or so reduction in total car travel over the next 25 years in the UK is as credible, if not more credible, than a 35% increase, which happens to align or did align with the central projection that one might expect from a national road traffic forecast then. There was considerable dissatisfaction with our present approaches, which were typically seen as regime compliant, and correspondingly considerable appetite to move towards a different approach. And I emphasize the word towards there because we're not throwing away all the good things we've developed as transport planners, but starting to evolve, perhaps have our own regime transition to something new. There was a sense that accountability, due process had grown while responsibility, real stewardship of the future had diminished. In spite of all the views expressed in the workshops, I characterised the sense overall as one of professional impotence, where we didn't feel individually that we could expose ourselves to challenging the orthodoxy of transport planning as individuals or as our individual employers. And perhaps we lacked the skills because the system overall was still geared towards the normalised orthodox way of doing things. I'm not proposing to read out this rather lengthy recommendation, but it's really what gave birth to the review that took place. So we recommended out of that work that it really was important to establish whether candidates for professional qualifications could demonstrate an awareness and application of the regime testing approach, but also this capacity to challenge dogma. In other words, challenging the principles or rules that seem to rather expect of us certain things that we can't question. And it was suggested that the review might question how the skills areas are interpreted, and therefore the competencies in turn are developed in professionals in our sector, and whether sufficient challenge to this dogma and encouragement to contemplate regime testing thinking is apparent or expected. Now, that's quite a challenging ask of the professional qualification when you go into the detail that many of you will be familiar with. So to the review itself. Well, the process that we followed, I should stress that this was involving a lot of voluntary time on behalf of all the people who contributed and gave their expert insights. So initially, the Professional Standards Committee, of which I was then a member, reviewed the existing paperwork and wording and started to get some orientation to where we might need to focus and consider change. And then we tried to identify the different stakeholder groups relevant to the qualification, which you can see on screen, and held a number of workshops, both in London, but also moving up to Scotland for 2 of the workshops to try and get some reach in that respect. So what did we learn from the review? Well, I guess first of all, in an overarching sense, almost unanimously, people agreed that it was indeed timely and appropriate to be undertaking this review, which we realised was in fact 10 years since the original qualification was set out and launched. And in undertaking the review, a strong feeling that yes, there should be greater emphasis given to the importance of constructive challenge, which you may have your own definition. This was my attempt at defining it, and I hope it acts as a useful steer. So really it's a capacity and willingness in all of us to question the appropriateness or robustness of orthodox approaches and consider how we might improve them, or how we can bring alternative approaches into the mix as well, complementary to existing approaches perhaps. And someone gave a very simple but very neat, powerful example, I felt at least, regarding constructive challenge. And perhaps some of you have almost had this experience. The client is saying, I want you to build a wall. As the consultant, you could say, how high do you want it? And carry on. Or you could ask, well, why do you want to build a wall? And what are the alternative options? And that's really just the beginning of a a different philosophy, I might say. Certainly Stephen Cragg has opened my eyes to realizing perhaps I'm as much a transport philosopher as anything else these days. Some further pertinent observations that came out from the review. I think the first one at the top here is pretty powerful. So distinguished figure, I might say, without naming them in our field, who was very much part of the genesis of the qualification and indeed perhaps of transport planning as a discipline, observed that the current period of churn in both professional understanding and institutional frameworks is unprecedented since the late 1960s and 70s. Compare that with someone earlier on in their career. And this was just an example of perhaps some of the frustrations that are shared, both if you're on the client side or the consultant side of the business. I know the problem is presenting a high level of uncertainty, but if I told the client a range of uncertainty, they wouldn't pay. And yet against that, coming back to constructive challenge, surely for all of us, transport planning should be about giving the best advice we can, even if the client doesn't want to hear it. Or if in fact you are the client, bringing the best challenge you can to the brief and to the work that's being presented to you by the consultant. So constructive challenge, as somebody neatly put it, changes a transport planner from good to great. And you'll notice while these are principles being set out, it's not so straightforward to turn all of that into revision of the very specific and carefully set out wording of the qualification. So when we did the workshops, we asked our participants, just as a traffic light exercise, so there's no hard science behind this, to look at each of the technical skills units and give an indication of how strong their feeling was that something might need to change within that skills unit in terms of the wording and how it's presented at the moment to those preparing to become qualified and indeed those practicing TPPs. And so you can see across the different units, to varying extents, people could see, well, at least it was unclear or there was some ambiguity about whether these units were entirely fit for purpose. But where you see the red, there was a clearer feeling that something was deficient, at least in partial terms, and needed attention. And it won't escape your notice that those two areas, perhaps three areas that need most attention are units A3 to A5. So the last thing I wanted to do in terms of, aside from saying, please take a look at the review if you get the chance at some point. I do think it's worth a read. It gives you an insight to some of the issues, tensions and opportunities that many fellow transport planners brought to light. But I've just picked out some of the points that for me stood out when I revisited the report, as you can see on this slide. I think constructive challenge is clearly important, but it's not particularly well articulated or self-evident in the way that the documentation had been set out hitherto. And certainly uncertainty isn't well enough addressed across the competencies as currently described. As I've said, three units particularly stand out as requiring attention, and that perhaps relates very much to the changing times we're living through, things which we perhaps hadn't so readily been able to identify back in 2008 when the qualification was launched. In terms of data, of course, that comes in all shapes and sizes now, qualitative and quantitative, different versions of what we think big might mean when we talk of data. But importantly, we know travel is a derived demand. So for heaven's sake, we must, of course, look upstream of only transport and traffic data sets. Transport modelling and forecasting, it was felt, was very much focused upon the how of modelling rather than the why. And this comes back to Stephen Cragg's philosophy, really, thinking a bit more deeply about what we have these tools for and what use we're putting them to. And there wasn't any reference to uncertainty or indeed other forms of forecasting, such as scenario planning in the unit as it stood. Appraisal and evaluation, the feeling was that this was leading rather towards a sense of compliance in coverage, focusing on standard techniques rather than emphasis on appropriate, again, drawing in the critical thinking, constructive challenge approach. And lastly, that perhaps the risk was that management skill units could be seen implicitly as the poor relation of the technical units, just by virtue of being placed afterwards, being labelled B rather than A. Nobody wants to be in the B team, of course. And that perhaps could be where some of the most important guidance to shaping of professionals needs to come as we move into this ever more challenging world that we're trying to shape. So just to finish, a reminder really that our journey goes on in a world that continues to change. I think you'll have heard these words of wisdom from many others. Change is now a constant. If you're banking on finding that position of stability, you may be a long time in looking. And just to cast across from the time we did the review, really, at about the time we launched that review report, Greta Thunberg had just set up her Twitter account. So pre-2018, many of us weren't quite as evangelical about climate change or as concerned about it as we are now. It wasn't until a year later that we really saw teeth coming into the UK position with the legislative position that Martin mentioned for 2050. And what I might say, another slap across the face for anything resembling orthodox transport planning came in the form of the Green Book review at the end of last year. I do encourage you, if you've not had a look at that, to dip inside. It's not a very long document. What it does highlight is that, and this is the HM Treasury telling us this of the Green Book, that they find that for many projects being proposed, the strategic case is very poor. Not enough time and attention has been given to it. And correspondingly, far too much emphasis is placed on getting the cost benefit analysis, the BCR, ultimately right, in inverted commas, without necessarily having that strategic positioning. And I think that plays very strongly into the way in which the Professional Standards Committee has been keen to ensure that our qualification continues to remain fit for purpose. And just to show you that not all of this is a pipe dream about regime change coming and a regime challenging approach in transport planning. Transport Scotland, not so long ago, launched their revised national transport strategy, predicated on a decide and provide approach, in which they've embraced uncertainty. At the very end of last year, Transport for the North launched their future travel scenarios, and you just need to read the subtext of their report, their adaptive planning to deliver our strategic vision in an uncertain world. And my friend and colleague Lynn Basford was party to developing this latest guidance note that just came out last month for TRICS. So if you're in the world of development planning and looking at transport assessments, a practical guide to the implementation of decide and provide. So things really are changing in transport planning. I think that makes it very exciting. It is challenging, and we need to have those skills and abilities and competencies in transport planning professionals. And I've every confidence that those will continue to be delivered. And with that, with a need for changing and redirecting professional competencies for a changing world, I'll hand back to you, Linda. Thank you very much for having the privilege of presenting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Glenn. So that was a brilliant summary of where we're at from the 10-year review, why the 10-year review was carried out, and what came out of that. So what I'll now lead into is effectively the outcome of that review and how the Professional Standards Committee have used it in some of the key points that have been taken forward. So I will just share my screen. Would someone be able to confirm that that has came through all right?
Yeah, we can see that, Linda.
That's perfect, thank you. So, in terms of the outcome of the review, over the last few years since the review was carried out, the Professional Standards Committee have effectively taken the outcome of the review and began to action it in reviewing in detail each of the TPP units and looking at any updates to wording and terminology that would need to be effectively carried out to launch a new set of units which are appropriate for today's transport planner and the profession going on. So effectively, the key priorities that were looked at was looking at changes in the profession since 2008. So taking into account, which I believe both Mark and Martin touched on, is the fact that transport planning as a profession has moved on in the last sort of 10 to 15 years and is no longer a subset of a different sort of one of the sort of civil engineering, traffic engineering professions, and is definitely a profession of itself. The review also looked like ensuring, as one of the key outcomes from the 10-year review, that constructive challenge is emphasised throughout the units, and ensuring that that is brought out, whether it's in the technical units or indeed the management units. The wording and terminology throughout the guidance has been updated to ensure that it continues to be appropriate throughout the units. This again goes from the management units through to the technical units, and it's also been updated to reflect a change in direction, but without changing the requirements. So I think one of the key things to emphasise at this point is that the bar has not been changed. Although the units have been updated and brought up to date for today's transport planner, the actual bar has not been changed, the qualification has not changed, the minimum competence levels which we will be looking for candidates to achieve when they apply for TPP has not changed. So I think that's just worth emphasising at this point, that although there has been changes in wording and terminology and possible emphasis changes throughout, the actual bar that we're looking for the qualification has not changed. There has been some change in structure of the units, as Glenn touched on. The management skills units were previously the B units, with the technical skills units being A units. So these have now been changed to P units for professional skills units, and are effectively the first units within the guidance, with the historic A units now being technical units and following the professional skills units. One of the other key items that the Standards Committee looked at throughout the review of the units was making TPP accessible to an international market as well. So that looked at removing references to guidance documents that were obviously UK based, and does leave the qualification open for the international market when we do launch in that. So that's just a very quick summary of the key items that the committee looked at when they were looking to update and reword where appropriate the units. In terms of the launch for the units, I'll just take you through the timeline. What I will say in terms of when the new documentation is available, there will be a changes document available for you to review, and the changes document just sets out in more detail for each individual unit what has been changed and the reasoning behind this, and the emphasis, where emphasis has changed, just to make sure that if you have already been working on your portfolio and are aware of the existing units, that you can quite easily see what changes have been introduced and understand those. So in terms of the timeline, the portfolio of, I'll apologise now, I have these the wrong way, that is a typo on my part. Portfolio of evidence is submissions in 2021 will be accepted for basically the new TPP guidance once it's launched officially on Monday, and the original TPP guidance and templates. Submissions in 2022, so that will be the spring submission for your professional review. At that point, you will be expected to use the new guidance and the new templates. In terms of the technical knowledge portfolio and the senior route application, those can be submitted at any time. So basically, submissions in 2021 will accept either the original guidance or the new guidance. And then again, any submissions from 2022 will be expected to be based on the new guidance. As Mark mentioned in his introduction, the professional development scheme is currently being updated, and that will also reflect the changes within the competencies, and that is due out next month. In terms of, again, what I was mentioning in terms of when we were looking at the review and wording updates, the internationalization, the first step in looking at this has commenced, and we will be looking to do a pilot for this before a full launch, with the pilot's being looked at for later in this year. I think a couple of other things just to mention, that obviously in 2020, the reviews were carried out remotely given the pandemic situation that we're in, and the reviews for 2021 will continue to be carried out remotely, with ongoing reviews once we're outside the pandemic situation, moving to both remote and, where required, a face-to-face review as historically. So I think a key thing is that the documentation will be available on both the CIHT and TPS websites from Monday. This is the documentation for the portfolio of evidence and portfolio of technical knowledge, with the senior route documentation following within the next couple of weeks. That's just having a few final updates. So I think that's probably, for the moment, I think that's all I'll say on the units. I believe the best thing is, if you're looking to be going forward for your review soon, whether you've already started pulling your evidence together or you're just starting to think about it, it's to have a read through of the new documents, have a read through of the guidance, and have a read through of the changes guidance if you are already familiar with the original units and what was being required there.
Linda?
Yes.
We've had a few questions. I don't know whether Glenn would like to pop up and join you again. So Jonathan has asked about, well, he's got a comment really about active data and passive data. Can you see that one in the chat?
I can. What I'll just do is stop sharing this now. I think that would probably be easiest to bring the chat up.
So another analysis of the data unit might be that it's primarily concerned with active data collection methods such as surveys and counts, to the detriment of passive data such as observational inference and always active data methods. So do either of you have a sort of a comment on that?
I can provide a comment in terms of the new guidance, and the new guidance definitely does address this from the point of view of it not just looking at active data collection and indeed quantitative data, and that is all explained in terms of the changes that have been made to the data unit in the changes document.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not sure.
I hope it wouldn't seem a glib answer, but I think it comes back to suitability of data rather than it being compliant or non-compliant with some notional set of or list of acceptable data sources. And I know from my involvement in the review and subsequently that, of course, the recognition that qualitative data is still data, but there are so many different types of data now that we are needing to consider dealing with. But I think fundamentally it's fitness for purpose that matters. And again, the issue of constructive challenge. If you're encountering a data set, you should be able to scrutinize that data set and make a judgment about its value and effectiveness for the task you're putting it to.
Thanks both.
Thanks, Glenn.
Lawrence has asked, does the guidance accommodate those working in future mobility?
I know I can give an immediate reaction to buy Linda some time on that. It's a personal view, of course. What I've come to realise, since I do hold a chair in future mobility and often wonder what that means, is that it's sort of 80 to 90% transport planning. You know, after all, we are all looking at the future of mobility. Now, I appreciate perhaps your question is more nuanced in getting at some of the particular developments, perhaps around technological innovation, that may not feel so central to transport planning. But my own view is that you should be very confident that a vast majority of what you're encountering and the skills you're developing, whether you see them applying to future mobility or transport planning, I would venture to suggest they probably apply to both, because the Venn diagram of those two terms is heavily overlapped.
I think I would add, I was reading the second half of Lawrence's question in terms of people previously looking elsewhere for chartered qualifications. I would agree with sort of Glenn's view in terms of the work being 90% transport planning, and I think it's worth highlighting again that the update that's been carried out hasn't removed the breadth that we're looking for from a transport planner going for the qualification. But it definitely shouldn't prohibit anyone, if they've specialised, from being able to review the units and see the areas where they are able to meet the required competency. So
Okay.
hopefully that answers Lawrence's question.
Thanks both. We had one from Ahmed, who was asking about the significance of structured physical infrastructure in terms of integrated transport planning. So that might be paraphrasing it a little bit, but it is there in the Q&A. No, that is in fact what he's asked, yeah. Would you please emphasize on the significance of structured physical infrastructure in terms of integrated transport planning?
Again, Linda, I'm happy to have a first go, but over to you if you'd like to.
No, if you want to have a first go, I'm just reading through it just in terms of the other half of his question. So on you go, Glenn.
I mean, the sentiment of the question, which I guess Linda and I are both making our way through, I think is right, that, you know, transport planning is about supply and demand, and the supply side is the infrastructure. Of course, you then move to a whole variety of different types of infrastructure. So, of course, what's been front and centre in many countries during the pandemic is, if you like, softer, smaller infrastructure, reallocation of road space to support active travel, as opposed to big capital infrastructure investments, in fact, some of which we've seen not going ahead as a result of learning new things about a changing society. But I think you're right, of course, to remind us that we're not doing transport planning in a vacuum. It's always about the supply and demand balance and relationship. That's what we concern ourselves with. That's not to suggest that we're expecting transport planners. Somebody was talking to me earlier today about self-healing concrete. I don't think that's within the competency set, even if I'm a civil engineer, so things like that still, or I used to be, things like that still excite me. But yes, I think you'll appreciate there's a boundary that has to be drawn somewhere in terms of what you're meaning by infrastructure as being part of the transport planning suite of competencies.
Perfect. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks both. A couple of people have asked about the spring review, the autumn review dates, and will they be the same? You know, are the new units affecting the actual submission deadlines? The submission deadline is still the 24th of September for the interviews, which will happen in November, but because we've moved to remote interviews, they'll probably stretch beyond that week period that's specified on the website. So we say interviews held 8th to 12th of November, it might be that we stray beyond that slightly because of the different arrangements that we have to put in place for the remote interviews. I think there've been one or two other sort of, if you like, operational, so process questions about TPP. So what will happen if portfolio of evidence is done in the autumn but isn't successful? Does that mean it would need, the new portfolio of evidence would need to follow in spring 2022? So I'm guessing that means, do I have to then amend my portfolio in some way? We are, correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, but I think we're looking for all candidates from spring 2022 to be using the new standards. But if someone's prepared a submission for autumn 2021 that is unsuccessful, I think the committee would consider whether or not we'd be asking those people to then reproduce all of their evidence against the new standard. So that might be another aspect of transition that the committee will need to look at.
Yeah, I think I would agree, Sue. That would be something that would be looked at on an individual basis, and would also depend in terms of the difference between if it was obviously the autumn 2021 to either an autumn or spring, say 2023, sort of the gap between the submissions in terms of that would also be considered by the committee.
Dave has made a comment about, until relatively recently, a lot of active travel measures were not fit for purpose. It's going to take some time to undo that reputation. So I think that's a comment which you may or may not want to respond to, or just nod or shake your heads. Then we have a question or a comment from someone about the PDS scheme. I understand the guidance is changing, but what about those who've spent the last 2 years working on the existing PDS template? So there is going to be, and Mark's popped up, and I'm sure he's going to say this, there is going to be a separate session run by TPS, picking up all of these sorts of issues, introducing the new PDS documentation and explaining the transition arrangements with regard to that scheme. Am I right, Mark?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, certainly it's our intent for people that are somewhere along that route to not have to redo all their submission onto new templates. That's not what we want to do at all. So we want to make it as easy for people that have already started.
Right, thank you. So I'm just trying to pick up some more questions. I believe TPP is more to do with multidisciplinary engineering, not just civil or IT engineering.
I would say, in terms of answering that one, TPP is obviously the transport planning professional, so I agree with Ahmed in terms of multidisciplinary, and obviously transport planning covers across the various transport planning disciplines, be that appraisal or modelling, active travel, behaviour change. So yes, it's not civil or IT engineering. I think if you're looking at the civil or IT engineering, you'd really be looking possibly to do one of the other qualifications that CIHT offer.
Yeah, so if anybody's got a query around what's the most suitable qualification for me, we're more than happy. If you, CIHT does what we call initial assessment for engineering qualifications. And if you dropped education@ciht.org.uk, a little email, we can give you some advice on whether CEng might be, which of the two are the best option for you, CEng or CTPP, because they are very different. TPP, as Linda says, focuses on transport planning competencies, and engineering is dealt with separately. Let's have a look here. So that's another one on PDS. So hopefully people have picked up on the fact, and you'll get notification of a separate session on that. Tools and techniques were mentioned in the slides, with more importance as an outcome of latest review. Few details on these tools. Do the tools include software related to modelling?
I think in terms of tools and techniques and the review, this you'll see when you look at the revised units. It could be where we've provided greater examples in terms of tools or techniques that could be used for that unit. And in terms of emphasis on it, there's also, we'll be looking for more emphasis on why. So it's not just about the being able to use, whether it's a modeling tool or a modeling technique, but also being able to understand and provide your understanding within your review, that you know why you're using that particular tool or that particular technique.
Thanks, Linda. And there's one on in here about post-COVID, what will happen with interviews? Will they continue to be remote, particularly for non-UK applicants? I think that the committee's looked at this, and where it's highly unlikely that we are going to go back to a situation post-COVID where all interviews are carried out face-to-face. So it's more likely that there will be a mixture. And certainly where people have to travel a long way to attend an interview, we wouldn't want candidates to be doing that, both from a cost point of view for individuals, and also a sort of a climate change. From the climate change point of view, we don't want people travelling unnecessarily if we can avoid it. Let's see, have I missed out anybody? Is somebody sitting there seething because I've missed their question?
I don't think so. I think I've been trying to follow the chat and the Q&A as well, Sue, and I think we've been through everything.
Right, taking TPP to international ground, further details. This is someone from India who works for a UK consultant. And I think, Linda, did you touch on the fact that almost the next phase of this is going to be the rollout internationally?
Yes, so the next phase is we are looking at the international rollout, and that will be, at the moment, the discussions are ongoing in terms of pilots for the rollout. So the exact detail around the pilots and the areas those would cover are still being discussed at the moment. However, that will be ongoing this year with a view to have a successful pilot and then fully launch the qualification internationally.
Right. One of the areas of experience required is cost-benefit analysis, which is said to be essential. If you don't have direct experience of this, could it still be relevant to include experience of projects that have contributed in some way to cost-benefit analysis or BCR, even if not involved in it directly? Now, I know that the committee looked at this quite closely, Linda.
Yes, and I think this is one of the units that has probably had possibly a greater amount of change. It was one of the ones that came up in Glenn's review, with the traffic light system as being one of the ones that did possibly need the greater amount of change. Let me just, if you don't have to do it with this, because it still be relevant to include. So I would say yes in terms of your submission. If you do not have direct experience, you could still put forward experience and projects that have contributed to it. However, I think if you're looking at that unit for a proficiency, I would definitely encourage you to have a detailed review of the wording of the new guidance to make sure that your level of experience in appraisal does actually meet all the relevant points for you to claim proficiency and not just experience. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think when people are able to have a look at the change document and the side-by-side versions, so for everybody's benefit, when the documentation is new documents are posted up on Monday, the committee has put together a document that identifies where the changes have been between the old and the new units. So you'll be able to see where the new units, for example, the appraisal unit, how that's changed, and perhaps where the emphasis lies, and where we've made some clarifications to answer those sorts of points around things like cost-benefit analysis. So it's difficult for you at the minute. I do appreciate that you can't see the new units, but certainly if you stand by your computers on Monday, you will be able to have access. And that change document hopefully will be useful for you to get an at-a-glance view of where the amendments have happened. I can't see, unless I'm missing them, any other things.
No,
here.
I can't see. There's definitely nothing new in the chat. I think we've been through all those in the chat. And I think
well,
the Q&A is covered as well.
We've got a whole 3 minutes left, but if that's all for now, everybody who's attended today, you'll get direct notification of links to the recording, links to the documentation. So, and any queries that you have, obviously anything you think about after the event, if you just send an email through to education@ciht.org.uk, because we are the link to the joint committee that looks at this, and we can get an answer for you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sue. I just take this opportunity to thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank everyone on the panel, so Mark and Martin for their introductions at the start, and Glenn for his presentation on the 10-year review. I'd also like to take this opportunity, since we are launching the new guidance, just to thank everyone that's been involved from everyone that attended workshops for the 10-year review. Obviously, Glenn in terms of carrying out the 10-year review, and both current and past members of the Standards Committee for the work that's went into looking at the guidance and launching this new guidance.
Linda, can I just make one last thing, because Mohammed has asked a very important question, just to confirm that the spring submission, this year's spring submission, is not affected. I can absolutely confirm the spring submission for coming up shortly is not affected. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.